Let's now turn to neoclassical economics and what came after Keynes and the modern synthesis. The neoclassical revolutionaries, Jevons, Menger, Walras, changed a lot about how we do economics and how we think about economies. This is the time that our modern notions of demand and supply were introduced, partial and general equilibrium and all that jazz. One important change is that in the neoclassical revolution, value became relative. It's our preferences, how much we want something, relative to its absolute scarcity or what it costs to produce something. That is what determines value. Previously, theories of value were absolute. It was the amount of labor contained in a product that it set its value, or it was what God was supposed to think about something that set the value of something. No longer in neoclassical economics. Partly because of this, and partly because the analysis had moved to the margin. Absolute scarcity was no longer seen as a core part of economics. This is also a reflection of the times. This was the time of the final push into Africa, at least from a European perspective, and India, the push into Siberia and the Far East in Russia, and also the push into the American West. So land seemed boundless, at least from the perspective of a white European. It was a time of rapid technological progress and rapid industrialization, and opportunities really seemed boundless to the people at the time. If we move further forward in time, Keynes again revolutionized economics, moving away from the micro of the neoclassical revolutionaries to the macro, and that revoked interest in economic growth as well. So the people who followed that in the modern synthesis of micro and macro theory, Harrod and Domer and Solow and Koopmans and all these people. If you look at the early growth models, you take the Solow growth model for instance, total output Y is a function of total factor productivity times capital raised to the power alpha times labor to the power 1 minus alpha. That is, economic output is determined by the amount of capital, the amount of knowledge, and the amount of labor that we have. There's no such thing as resource limits in this. So by now we're into the 60s and the 70s of the 19th century, and environment is not really part of the core curriculum of economics. There were some exceptions to this, as I said before. Jevons, already in 1865, worried about running out of coal, but Jevons, for all his prominence, did not change the analysis in that sense. Hotelling, another key economist working in the 1920s and the 1930s, also worked on the economics of exhaustible resources, but that part of his work was largely ignored until much later in the 1970s. What also happened after the neoclassical revolution is that we developed a rigorous theory of what we consider to be good socially and bad, and all that goes back to the work of Jeremy Bentham, who argued that the social good is the sum of the individual good, greatest good for the greatest number. But of course, our modern notion of this rests on the work of Pareto, particularly Pareto superiority, where a situation is considered to be Pareto superior to another situation if no one is worse off and at least one person is better off. If you combine this with Aristotle's notion that a voluntary exchange is in the mutual benefit of the people engaging in that exchange, that is, voluntary exchange is Pareto superior, then that implies that a free market where exchanges are voluntary becomes Pareto optimal, and this was sort of argued by Adam Smith. It was shown graphically by Abel Lerner and shown analytically by Harold Hotelling. And that is still very much the basis of how we think about this. It's of course important here to make a distinction, if we're talking about policy interventions, between actual and potential Pareto optimality, where actual is that nobody is worse off and at least somebody is better off, so the sum total is greater, whereas potential Pareto optimality only has that the sum total is greater, and therefore there can be a system of transfers. The surplus of the winners can be partially redistributed to the losers of the policy intervention. But actual and potential Pareto optimality are of course different things, because those transfers don't always take place. It's important to emphasize that even though environmental issues were not really core to the economic discipline for a very long time, from the Neoclassical revolution all the way up to the 60s and the 70s, the early Neoclassical economists did realize that there were issues here. Marshall already noted that externalities would wreck the whole issue of Pareto improvement. And externalities are the unintended and uncompensated consequences of one agent on another. If that is the case, then an exchange is not entirely voluntary, because an exchange imposes a cost on somebody else who is not part of the exchange. And Marshall noted that, if that is the case, then a free market will not lead to a Pareto optima. Marshall did not quite know what to do with that, but Pigou, writing in 1920, did. And he argued that a system of taxes and subsidies could counteract the problems associated with negative and positive externalities. The taxes go to the negative externalities and the subsidies to the positive ones. Marshall also worked on the over-exploitation of common properties. So neoclassical economies did have a notion of public goods and public bads that is actually much in line with what we nowadays think about these things. So many of the core themes of our environmental and resource economics go back to the early days, but the neoclassical economists themselves, as well as the Keynesian economists, as well as the modern economists, do not think much about the environment, or for that matter natural resources.